I'm going to refer you to Genesis chapter 23 today, and if you're going to turn there and read along with me, you may be a little bit triggered, I guess is the word these days, by the title of the lesson here, the idea of being an alien residing among you. That is a phrase that comes up a lot. And if you want to accuse me of clickbait, I guess you can go ahead and do that. We're not going to get political in this space, but I do want to emphasize the nature of our dual citizenship, if you want to look at it that way, as Christians. Our citizenship ultimately is in heaven. We'll get to that in a second from Philippians chapter 3 verse 20. But primarily, in the short term anyway, we're living here on planet Earth. And we find ourselves in a kind of similar situation as Abraham finds himself. Hebrews especially talks a lot about this, chapter 11, about how Abraham lived in faith in what would be the promised land, the land that would be given to his nation that would come from him and his son Isaac. In the meantime, though, he was a wanderer. He just went from place to place without any kind of land, except for what we find here in the story in Genesis chapter 23, when he buys a piece of land to bury his wife Sarah, who had just passed away. And when he says there in verse 3 rather, Abraham got up beside his dead wife. He spoke to the Hethites, "I am an alien residing among you. Give me burial property among you so that I can bury my dead." And he goes on to emphasize here, it's not that he wants to bury Sarah in somebody else's land. He wants to bury Sarah in his own land, his own piece of property that he is going to purchase for himself. And we're not going to take the time to go back and read the entire context here. The whole chapter covers this story, which clearly is a very elaborate and perhaps even ritualistic real estate deal that is taking place. Abraham has or at least appears to have a very good standing among the locals there, and they're willing to do this transaction for him. I've always suspected that a lot of this is ritual, that they're just kind of going through the motions of saying, here, you can have the land for free, knowing that Abraham is going to say, no, I will pay for the land, etc. They would get around to paying full market price for the piece of property, and he pays that price, and he buries his wife there. And perhaps this is an indication of his big picture desire, the long-term plan, his plan, and especially God's plan, to establish himself and his nation here in this place. And they would have as much of a permanent dwelling as you can have in the physical world, anyway, for people of faith. And I realize that opens up some pretty big cans of worms, and who exactly owns this property from a political standpoint or a nationalistic standpoint. These are issues that are 3,000 plus years old at this point. We're not going to get them settled here today. But for our purposes here, Abraham did not own this property. He wanted to own a piece of the property, and he did. He exercised that right. But while he was doing that, he acknowledges, by the very nature of these things, he didn't have a right to do just whatever he wanted to do on somebody else's land. It wasn't appropriate to just leave a dead body someplace. He needed to make arrangements for a proper disposal, a proper burial of his wife, just as in the same way that he would have negotiated in some fashion for grazing grounds. And there's national customs that would be brought up here, and traditional roles, etc. We don't want to get into a big discussion about all those kind of political and economic kind of issues here. The point that we're getting at is that we also are aliens residing among people who pertain to this land more directly than we do. We are citizens of heaven. They are citizens of the earth. That comes with certain obvious advantages for us. It comes with certain advantages for them in the short term. And we need to acknowledge that and appreciate that and know where the boundaries are, what our proper behavior is in a territory that is not ours, that pertains to other people who have a very different lifestyle than we do, very different customs than we do, speak different languages, wear different clothes, all of the above. We have a role to play in this foreign land. And I'm going to suggest to you a handful of things that we need to commit to as people of God, things that are not necessarily fair, quote unquote fair, or reasonable, but that we do because we want to live in peace in this place. We want to be given certain accommodations and certain considerations and certain deferential treatment, or at least fair treatment, nice treatment. We don't want to be thrown in jail simply because we don't belong here. We want to play the game to a certain degree, but we're not going to play this game in such a way as to compromise who we really are or where our home truly is. Perhaps the most obvious or the most practical way of emphasizing that is the idea of law keeping. If you go to somebody else's house and they have some weird, you have to take off the shoes before you come into their house, or you're not allowed to do this or that, or you can't put your elbows on the table, whatever kind of rules there are. I think that we would be reasonable enough to acknowledge that while we're in someone else's house, we abide by their rules. There may be some limitations to that, but the general rule is they set the rules, we abide by the rules, and if we don't like those rules, we don't have to come to their house. And in a larger sense, that's the way it is on planet Earth. We live in this way station, this place that we are going to be here for a while until we go to something better. While we are here, we abide by the rules of the land in which we are living, whether that's the United States of America, or whether that's France, or Uganda, or any other nation that we're in. We're going to abide by those laws. We're going to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's while we are here. Now, there are limitations to that. We're going to get to that in a second. But generally speaking, the idea of acknowledging who we are and where we belong does not preclude polite cooperation, lawful cooperation in this place that we are. First Peter chapter 4 deals with this, and other passages also in the New Testament talk about this concept, because it was much more pronounced, much more obvious, I suppose, back then than it is today in our culture, or at least the way that it tends to be in our culture. There doesn't seem to be any kind of obvious interference with our lives as Christians while we're living in a relatively free nation, a nation that supposedly is based on godly biblical principles, et cetera, et cetera. That may not be quite so much the case in other places or in other times, but generally speaking, this is not a difficult kind of thing for us to do. We make it difficult when we refuse to acknowledge the role that we have here in this life. We do have a role, and lots of times, just like it was back in Jesus' day, it comes down to money. I cannot pay my taxes because I'm a Christian and because I have a higher calling, and because, whatever rationalization you might want. Those people don't generally have any problem with earning money in Satan's world, but the idea of giving it away to the government, they're not so keen on that. Well, I understand that. I don't like paying taxes any more than anybody else does. But Jesus makes it quite clear. While you're living in this world, you're going to abide by these rules. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Just because your life is uncomfortable, just because people are picking on you in your own mind, and maybe they really are. Maybe they're deliberately picking on you. Such seems to have been the case in Peter's day. That doesn't mean that the rules don't apply anymore. It just means you're suffering. It means that you're uncomfortable. It means that situations are not as ideal as you would like them to be. Well, that's going to be true for everybody, believe it or not. Maybe it's a little bit more true for you and me as Christians, but either way, Peter's words rather in 1 Peter chapter 4 are, I think, very valid. Verse 15 and 16, let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or a meddler, but if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in having that name. The idea that your life might be uncomfortable in Satan's world because you refuse to play by Satan's rules, that's not a new thing. That's always been the case. That comes part and parcel with the idea of being an alien. This culture is not built around you. It's not reasonable to think that the culture is going to accommodate you. You're going to have to accommodate the culture. And when you don't, there will be negatives to that. We should accept that as the price of doing business in Satan's world here. That is not an excuse for us to rebel and push back and say, I'm going to do my own thing instead of doing the government's thing, doing the legal thing, etc. Again, and we're going to talk about this in a second here in the next point, the idea of never breaking a law, never refusing to acknowledge the sovereignty of government, that can be a problem. You can get to the point where government or culture or whatever becomes your God or your Lord instead of the Lord God. That's a mistake. You shouldn't do that. Generally speaking, though, if you can participate in the local culture and not have it conflict with your culture as a Christian, then that is something that you should accept and to a certain degree perhaps even embrace. There may be a certain way in which you can facilitate your connection with people in the world, finding commonality with them. The Apostle Paul, for instance, in Athens, quotes from the pagan scholars, the pagan poets there on Mars Hill. The idea of appealing to culture, customs, the lay of the land. Oh, hey, there's an idol over here that you probably don't even know what that's talking about. Let me tell you about that. That might be a good way to open doors of conversation to explain why it is that you don't really fit in very well with the culture that's around you. All that to say, there is a place for us to embrace this world that we are living in, to go to the local, high school football games, or to watch the movies that everybody else is watching, or whatever. There can be, and this is always understood, whether it's stated or not, we do not want to compromise who we are. If Acts chapter 21 and verses 20 through 26, the Apostle Paul is drawn back into his culture of his youth, of his young adulthood. He is exactly how much he's pushing back against the law of Moses at this point. The text doesn't really address in the book of Acts. Eventually, he is going to push back considerably against this culture, but at no point does he ever say it's a sin to be a Jew. It's a sin to observe the Sabbath day or circumcise your male children or any such thing as that. In this particular situation, he has an opportunity to interact with Jews, especially Jewish Christians, and help them connect with him and maybe even soothe some ruffled feathers, as it were. That's not going to work. I think maybe James is either idealistic or just delusional with regard to how this is going to help. But he thinks that if the Apostle Paul can complete this vow that he has taken in the ritualistic Jewish fashion and complete his vows and have witnesses there with him, go through all the measures that they would do as cultural Jews, then perhaps this would show he has not completely abandoned his heritage. He's not become a Gentile in the fullest sense. He's not quit on the Jewish nation entirely, which Paul had not. He says wonderful things about the Jewish nation, especially in the book of Romans. And he's willing to go about doing this. I struggled with this for quite a while as a younger preacher, trying to figure out exactly how Paul could hold on to Jesus and yet submit to the law of Moses. Well, he's not submitting to the law of Moses. He's submitting to local customs in such a way as to not compromise his faith. Now, in other situations, Galatians chapter 2 comes up, for instance. He has an opportunity to avoid circumcising Titus because he has a point to prove. Titus is a recipient of the Holy Spirit. He got that without being circumcised. He's going to keep that without being circumcised. This is a point that needs to be made. But not just for the sake of sticking your thumb in somebody's eye. You're not going to be offensive just for the sake of being offensive. I don't see any point in breaking up a July 4th celebration and saying, hey, you're all excited about this land that you're living in. You need to reject this land. You need to reject land, any land that human beings are inhabiting, and embrace the culture of heaven that I'm proposing to you here, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know that would be especially effective. I don't know that would be something that would be appropriate even. Maybe it would be a better thing to jump headfirst into this culture and say, yes, isn't it a wonderful thing to be free? Isn't it a wonderful thing to celebrate our independence, as it were? But, let's talk about what freedom looks like in Jesus, for instance. Freedom in America doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. Freedom in Jesus doesn't mean you can do whatever you want either. But the idea of being able to make your own choices is a wonderful kind of, and I don't need to preach that sermon here today. But the idea of being a part of this culture is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it is obvious to ourselves and to our neighbors where our true allegiance lies. And here's another point, and we kind of touched on this already. The attitude that we take toward those people in positions of government, including and particularly the people in government who don't seem to be especially aligned with our values, who don't seem to be especially interested in our problems, interested in preserving our rights, or as we may perceive them to be rights, etc. The idea of praying for government is a very consistent and important concept. We see it all over the New Testament. Jesus emphasizes this. We talked about the rendering to Caesar, etc. But in this world that in many ways was necessarily contrary to things of Jesus, and to a certain degree, maybe a little bit less so, still contrary to the things of Jesus, our role is always to be passive and encouraging participants in such things when we can. Now, sometimes as we've already mentioned, sometimes it's just not possible to do that. But by and large, no matter what is going on, no matter how good or how poorly things are going for us in this culture, we can do what Peter tells us to do first and foremost, and that's to pray. In verse number 13 of 1 Peter chapter 2, submit to every human authority because of the Lord, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors as those who sent out by him to punish those who do what is evil and praise those who are doing what is good. For it's God's will that you silence the ignorance of foolish people by doing good. Submit as free people, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but as God's slaves. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood and brothers and sisters. Fear God. Honor the emperor. The idea of submitting to government and wishing to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Praying for our sources of government. Romans chapter 13 talks about this also. The idea of praying for these officials that are trying to kill us may seem contrary to common sense and to all of our neighbors, etc. Maybe that's part of the solution. Maybe by showing that we are concerned with these people who are trying to kill us, we can show that we have found a better way, a more noble way, a more selfless way, something that is not pertaining to the just having our itches scratched here on earth while we're waiting for just to die and be buried. We have other things in mind, and it necessarily impacts every aspect of our life for the better. We are at peace. We find joy in Jesus, and it doesn't matter what kind of circumstances we are in. We have this tranquil life that Paul talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 1 and 2. At least we're praying for that tranquil life. This is what we want out of government. We just want to be allowed to do our thing. And this has nothing to do with tax rates. This has nothing to do with any kind of special provisions or anything like that. We simply want, as much as can be allowed to be the case, to do what we do, to live our lives as Christians. The Latino community wouldn't appreciate it if we made Cinco de Mayo illegal in the United States. Nobody's trying to do that. Nobody would want to do that. It's, to a certain degree, understood and even approved that you understand where you come from and that you're excited about that and you want to embrace that heritage in a foreign land. It makes you feel more at home, etc. We as Christians want that kind of courtesy in Satan's world, and we don't always get it. And that's kind of the way it is these days, and it's always been that way. But wouldn't it be nice if we could have that? That's what we're praying for. We're asking that the government allow us to pursue our practice of faith, to pursue our worship in such a way as is pleasing to God, that we don't have to hide in caves and do things undercover and have secret codes and all that kind of thing, as apparently was the case in previous lifetimes. We would like the government to allow us to do our thing, and if government's willing to do that, then we're going to declare victory with regard to that. We don't need special protections. We don't need special rights or privileges or whatever. We simply want to be allowed to do what Jesus has asked us to do without being considered criminals for having done so. And perhaps even more important than any of the rest of this, we as Christians claim the right to tell people about our homeland. We want to be in this foreign land telling people about where we came from, where we are going, how this holds our true allegiance. And if that makes us look unpatriotic, then let us be unpatriotic, whatever. But hopefully we have set ourselves up with the previous points to emphasize it's not that we hate America or we hate planet Earth. It's just that we belong someplace else, and we're going someplace else. Our citizenship is in heaven, the text says there in Philippians chapter 3, verse 20. And that's going to govern every choice that we make, every significant choice that we make. It's going to govern our attitude and our behavior, our thought processes, our value system, all of the above. It should be, and if it's not, there's a serious problem, it should be evident from the way that we live our lives that there is a disconnect between our lifestyle, our choices, our value system, etc., and the world that we're living in. They don't quite fit in. Maybe they're trying to fit in. Maybe they're good neighbors and they you know, behave the law. They don't kill people and steal things. And this is nice. They seem to be decent people as far as the general definition of decent people seems to be. But they're kind of weird. They don't fit in all that well. And maybe that's not such a good thing. Well, we try to emphasize that it's not about being a good thing or a bad thing. It's about being Christians. And we will take whatever kind of slings and arrows come at us because of that. We'd rather them not come, of course. But regardless of how we are received in Satan's world, we're going to show ourselves to be citizens of heaven. We are aliens residing among the people of the world. And we accept the penalties that come with that. We pray that they be minimized. I'm not going to apologize for that. But whatever the world throws at us in this foreign land, we will accept that. And to a certain degree celebrate that, because we know that greater things are coming, and whatever suffering we encounter on the way there is simply yet another way of connecting ourselves to Jesus Christ, who suffered far more than we ever could. If we feel uncomfortable in Satan's world, imagine how Jesus felt in human form, living among us without sin, without flaw, without telling lies, etc. This is what Jesus did for us. And if living a somewhat uncomfortable life of faith here in this earth while we're waiting to be completely transformed into his image in heavenly realms, if that's what it takes to be a citizen of heaven here on earth, then we are absolutely willing and eager to do that with whatever days, whatever years God gives us here in this earth. I hope that this is a blessing to you. I hope that you will continue to live your life as a Christian and prioritize God's things. Be a good citizen of earth, certainly, as much as you can. But more than anything else, be a citizen of heaven. Thank you very much, and God bless.